Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Civics Project. I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our latest episode on the theme of social security. Before we get started with our content today, I want to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Torongar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanuk Vitam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So as I've mentioned, our topic today focuses on social security in the United States. And I want to note that social security has often been dubbed the most popular social policy in US history. And I want to start our conversation today by talking a little bit about the history. Where did the US social security system come from, and what were the circumstances and factors that led to its emergence? So when the United States did not exist as a nation yet, but was preceded by a series of colonies, the sort of British model that was imported to the United States was known as poor laws. And these were always municipal laws, meaning they were at the level of local townships or sometimes counties. And they were laws that were set up to address the needs of poor people economically. And generally, these were laws that would distinguish between poor people who were worthy of help and those who were unworthy. So there were some municipal laws set up to take care of poor people who were deemed worthy of economic assistance. They weren't consistent. Not every municipality had them or had the same ones, but this was the basic model in the colonial period and into the early formations of the United States in and after the Revolutionary War period. Beginning in 1862, we saw the introduction of Civil War pensions for people who had been disabled in war, or for widows and orphans of soldiers who had died in the Civil War. So we started to see the state create a way to take care of people who, by reason of disability or family vulnerability after the loss of a breadwinner, needed economic help. But again, this was attached to veterans or their families. One of the other 19th century precursors was embodied in a movement that was started by a man named Jacob Coxey, who in many instances was considered a failed politician. He often lost his runs for office. But he decided to create what he called an army of the unemployed. And he called on unemployed people to march on Washington in 1894 and got at least 10,000 people to initially join him, but many didn't make it, basically trying to travel all the way across the United States in the 19th century. So approximately 500 actually made it to the District of Columbia, the District to DC. So Coxey was arrested shortly after he arrived for walking on grass of the Capitol building, and the protest basically disbanded once he was arrested. So these are some of the reasons he was considered a failed politician. However, the public attention he generated helped ground the notion of federal economic relief and public works, and is partially credited for the eventual 20th century introduction of unemployment insurance, which was part of the original Social Security program. Coxey was so invested in his economic ideals, including later debates about what the monetary standard should be, meaning how we should judge the worth of money in the United States, that he had a son who he actually named Legal Tender. So his son's name was Legal Tender Coxey. So Coxey is generally understood as part of the history building up to the Social Security program in the United States. Other things that were very important to note, one was just the series of economic depression that the United States suffered in its first couple centuries, first 150 years really. So we often think of the Great Depression, which took place from 1929 to 1939, as the most significant in US history. There were actually, in many ways, equally devastating ones, both in the 1840s and in the 1890s. And so when you consider Coxey's March on Washington in 1894, it was right in that period of the second major depression in the United States. And so, the US populations over different generations had already been through several rounds of severe economic desperation and crash, in which we had large numbers of people who were impoverished and needing economic relief. So in the 1930s, many states started to introduce what were called old age pensions. And they did this because during the Great Depression, the elderly were becoming increasingly poor. And about 50% in that period of elders in the United States were unable to economically support themselves. So over a period of a few years, about 30 states created old age pension programs, but most of them didn't work very well. So the vast majority of the elderly poor, and keep in mind that about 50% of the elders nationwide were in poverty at that point, meaning they were unable to support themselves economically. On average, only 3% of the elderly in each state were actually getting helped by those programs. And there were different reasons. Some had a lot of eligibility restrictions, so not everybody qualified. Some elders weren't applying because they were ashamed of the idea of being on welfare. And many states just passed laws but failed to fully implement them. So most of the money that was actually getting paid out through those state programs was coming out initially through California, Massachusetts, and New York, even though approximately 30 states had programs. There were some other contributing factors that led to the creation of Social Security in the United States. One in the 20th century was increased life expectancy, and we can explain that in a number of different ways, but the important and undeniable fact was that people were living longer. The second was the loss of extended family due to urbanization. And a third factor was urbanization itself, which was creating new economic demands, sometimes higher cost of living, and often creating more fragmented communities. And the fourth factor was the Industrial Revolution itself, although, though this is often listed as a factor, we can see it as, in many ways, having generated the loss of extended family and urbanization. To understand what I mean by all those terms, right, we talk about urbanization as people moving from rural areas into cities. In 1890, 28% of the population was living in a city. In 1930, 40 years later, that number had doubled from 28% to 56%. So more than half the country was moving to cities. This was breaking up a lot of extended families because people were not living in the same places. And that also meant that elders didn't always have the same support as their adult children were farther away or not necessarily living with them anymore. So we see these sets of breakdowns occurring, which resulted in increased elder poverty, which flared most intensely in the Great Depression era of 1929 to 1939. So all of this helped build, and these are not the only factors that contributed, but they are some of the major ones that are generally acknowledged. So all of this helped build to the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, and it was passed in August 14th of 1935 under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. So that's the date he signed it into law. The Social Security Act was understood at that time as a social insurance model. So by 1935, a lot of other Western nations had already implemented social insurance programs, where insurance is defined as a government-created protection against a defined risk, which in this case is poverty. And the social means that it's a broad policy concern, not just a response to individual needs. And the risks that the social insurance programs were potentially addressing in that time included disability, death, aging, and unemployment. So by the time the US implemented its model, there were already 34, mostly European nations that already had social insurance programs that were somewhat comparable. And 20 of those, like the United States, has what's called a contributory element. So contributory in this case means that people are paying into this social insurance program and then can expect to get something back when they need it. So Social Security withholding, which those of us who work see taken out of paychecks in the United States, was implemented as this contributory element to the Social Security Act of 1935. I want to just briefly quote something that President Roosevelt said upon signing the Social Security Act, because it gives us a little context about how federal policy conceived of the program at the time. Roosevelt said, quote, "We can never ensure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age." So this highlights the fact that at the time, the law was primarily considered protection against poverty when aging and against job loss. And the act itself was considered a very moderate and modest compromise. So there, especially in the Great Depression era, were much more ostensibly radical calls for the state to take responsibility for the economic welfare or well-being of its citizens. This was very common during the Great Depression. There were a lot of different proposals, some of which would have created a significantly more expansive set of protections. And so the Social Security Act was viewed as a compromise by moderate politicians. The original act of 1935 included old age assistance, aid to dependent children, the foundation of AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, unemployment insurance, which we now usually think of as separate from Social Security, but in the beginning they were together. And it also had grants to states to support medical care. Disability coverage and federal medical benefits like Medicare came later. Title II of the original act contained what we now primarily think of when we talk about Social Security. It provided for paycheck withholding, which went into a joint fund that then would be returned as benefits at the retirement age of 65. The act also established a Social Security board, which was tasked with figuring out implementation, guidance to states and to employers, how to explain Social Security to the public, and was also tasked with staffing personnel in field sites all around the nation. So basically setting up the entire infrastructure was initially in the hands of this board, which, as I recall, started as 3 people at the top plus some support staff. The Senate, although the act had passed, launched a filibuster. For those of you who attended last week's session, you learned a little bit about the history of the filibuster. So they launched a filibuster in August of 1935 to stall the program by stalling its budget. So the act had passed, but the Social Security Board had no funding. And the Senate was able to stall its budget for another several months. And in the interim period then in fall of 1935, when the Social Security Board was trying to start its work, it had to do so by borrowing money from other federal agencies to get off the ground. And then finally in January of 1936, Congress actually funded it. In 1946, 10 years later, the Social Security Board was replaced by the Social Security Administration, the historical version of the SSA, the Social Security Administration that we know today. They then had to create Social Security numbers and get people around the country to apply and register to get their Social Security numbers. And in January of 1937, before the SSA was formed, I should also note, they first started doing the withholding of FICA. So some of you have sometimes looked at paychecks and wondered what FICA means, F-I-C-A. It stands for the First Federal Insurance Contributions Act and is still sometimes collected today from workers in paychecks. And that money is paid into Social Security trust funds. So as of today, more than $7 trillion have been paid back out of those funds, and about 8 trillion have been collected. The earliest applicant retired one day after the program began. So the Social Security Act was implemented. There was a man who retired the next day. So he had 5 cents in total withheld from his very last paycheck for that one day. And he then received a lump sum single Social Security payment of 17 cents. The lowest Social Security payment ever on record was for 5 cents. So obviously these were in 1930 dollars, but we get the sense of where the act started. And lump sums initially were part of how Social Security works. The monthly benefits came later in 1940. So I want to just walk us through some of the amendments to the Social Security Act of 1935. 1939 first created dependent benefits and survivor benefits. So basically what that meant is that you could be eligible for some benefits if you were the dependent, the child, for instance, of a person who was a Social Security recipient, or if a Social Security recipient died, their family member could be eligible for some survivor benefits. This moved Social Security from a program that was solely focused around rights of workers and made it more of a family-oriented program. As mentioned in 1940, the Social Security Act was amended to provide for monthly rather than lump sum payments. And the 1950s were very important because they introduced COLAs, or cost of living adjustments. So one of the major flaws in the initial Social Security program was that the amounts of money that people were paying in through paycheck withholding were not then later being adjusted for inflation. So people might pay into the Social Security program and then be eligible for a lot less in contemporary dollars at the time of their retirement, which therefore meant that it was often unsuccessful in keeping people out of poverty. So the 1950s era saw the introduction of COLAs, cost of living increases, so that Social Security benefits would keep pace to some extent with the actual cost of living at the time of retirement. 1954 saw the introduction of disability-based benefits through Social Security. So these did not exist in the initial 19 years, but were introduced as a legislation in 1954. 1961 saw the introduction of Medicare, and the eligibility for old age-based insurance also was lowered to age 62. 1972 marked the creation of what's now known as SSI, or Supplemental Security Income. So where standard Social Security benefits based on retirement are not need-based per se, you can be eligible for some payments whether or not you're at risk of poverty based on what you paid out through your paychecks. SSI is need-based, and before 1972, the federal government was putting some funding into states and municipalities to create need-based economic aid for elderly people, for people who are blind, or for people who are otherwise disabled. So support had existed for these categories as of 1950, but it had been locally administered and sometimes pretty chaotic. So the federal funding was putting the money out, but not really monitoring how it was administered or who it was reaching. So the SSI program, Supplemental Security Income, centralized these programs at the federal level and put them under the control of the Social Security Administration. 1996 and 1997, a fairly right-wing era in Congress, saw the passage of a set of pieces of legislation called the Contract of America. And a couple of these significantly affected Social Security. One was that the Contract with America began restricting disability benefits in instances where the disability had roots or root cause in alcohol or drug use. So for instance, let's say a person was hospitalized or in care awaiting liver transplant due to alcoholism. This could disqualify them for disability benefits unless they had another way to be qualified. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, also known as welfare reform, gutted a number of the provisions of the original Social Security Act and those that followed it by reducing access to aid to families with dependent children. It also terminated SSI eligibility for most non-citizens. So there had been some eligibility for legal permanent residents or legal immigrants to be eligible for Social Security based on economic need. And the Contract of America terminated that, so only citizens could benefit from the program. In 2000, there was a repeal. This is a major change, a repeal of the retirement requirement. So it meant that a person at the age of 65, 66 could continue to work and start to collect Social Security benefits. So aging people could work without losing eligibility for retirement benefits. Just to give you a sense, today about 1/7 of the US population is currently receiving a Social Security benefit, whether it's based on economic need, disability, or age. And over 90% of the workers estimated in the United States are covered or in the program in some way. There are a couple more contemporary things to note. One in the Obama era, which was really disturbing, was that in 2009, Congress, with signature from Barack Obama, repealed retroactive benefits to anyone who was incarcerated or anyone violating probation or parole conditions. So the basic idea was if you were eligible for Social Security, you would lose it and not get it back while incarcerated, or if you were found in violation of probation or parole conditions. The reason I say that this was a disturbing development was that it basically, at least has arguably increased recidivism. So the fact that people could not access survival level economic benefits after release increased the chances that people would be rearrested, reincarcerated. What we have today, so that runs through, there are more amendments that I haven't covered, but that's run through a lot of the major ones that I think are important to know about. So what we have today is a very complex system with multiple embedded programs, including SSI, so Supplemental Security Program, which we talked about as need-based. There's also an SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, which is different from SSI because it doesn't have to be need-based, but you are eligible for it if you become too disabled to work, provided that you have been working enough to pay into the SSDI program. So it basically creates more benefits eligibility for people who are working and become disabled, too disabled to work, as opposed to people who have never or rarely been able to work. As we know, we continue to have retirement age Social Security. More medical programs are now associated with the Social Security Administration. And we continue to have some social welfare programs for poor families, though many of them, as noted, have been amended or affected over the years. I will note that we did see eventually a restoration of access to need-based welfare benefits for children who are not citizens in interestingly, the George W. Bush era. So not for adults, but for children, for instance, you can have access to food stamps if you're a non-citizen. Today, when people are trying to figure out, like, how do I begin to use the system? What do I do? There's a program, or rather a tool, known as BEST, B-E-S-T, which stands for the Benefits Eligibility Screening Tool, and it helps individuals figure out, do I qualify for any sort of Social Security benefit? And if so, what that might be. The last thing that I want to note before moving into a book recommendation and some quick civics trivia is that Social Security is likely to continue to be a subject of increasing attention in the District of Columbia and in state level policy, because we have such a large aging population as the baby boom generation continues to retire. So one of the challenges that our governments face today is that the amount of money that the baby boomers have paid into Social Security substantially exceeds what the government has actually held in trust. So our government owes our retirees a lot of money, which it spent. And what we see is that while our budget is already in some crisis, and we have the largest national debt, even controlling for inflation, that we've ever seen in the United States, we also have a lot of retirees who are going to be paying out a lot less in taxes as they retire, and are going to be expecting back the money that they've paid into the system. So the question of, will Social Security become further restricted? Can the United States meet the needs of its elders, and so forth, is a primary economic and social question that this generation and subsequent generations of policymakers, voters, and advocates are going to have to keep engaging with. I'd like, for those who would like to sort of know more about the history and context, particularly of the restrictions on need-based Social Security, I recommend the book, The War on Welfare, Family, Poverty, and Politics in Modern America. And the author of that is Marisa Chappell. For our Zoom audience, I'll be sure to put that reference into the chat. The book title, again, is The War on Welfare, Family, Poverty, and Politics in Modern America, and the author is Marisa Chappell. Now, for those familiar with the Civics Project, you know that when we don't have a special guest, we take the time to do some brief civics trivia. And today is no exception, so we're going to share 3 trivia questions for our Zoom audience. You'll be able to see those on slides, but I'll also read them out for our listening audience. So first, to qualify for disability benefits, which of the following must apply? A, you must be presently unable to work. B, you're not expected to be able to work within the next 12 months. C, you must be living below the poverty line. D, A and B. Or E, all of the above, A, B, and C. And the right answer here is A and B. You must be unable to work when you apply, and you must have medical documentation indicating that you will not be able to return to work within the next year. So it doesn't have to be permanent, but it has to at least be a year or more. It can't just be a temporary medical leave to qualify for disability benefits. Second question, can children receive Social Security benefits? Yes, children under the age of 18 can receive benefits in some cases if a parent's receiving benefits. Yes, disabled children under the age of 22 can receive benefits in some instances. Yes, children may receive benefits if a parent is eligible, who is eligible for Social Security dies. D, all of the above, or E, none of the above. And the answer, as you might expect, is all of the above. There are different restrictions and rules about eligibility, but children can receive benefits. And here I'm referring mostly to disability or retirement benefits that are attached to their parents. So if a parent qualifies for benefits, a child may receive some too if they're under the age of 18, or if they're the disabled child under the care, they're still dependent of a parent who qualifies for Social Security. They can be eligible up until the age of 22. And children may sometimes receive benefits if a Social Security eligible parent dies. For retirement, what's the average Social Security monthly benefit today? Answer choice A, $1,543. Answer choice B, $3,148. C, $4,020, or D, none of the above. And the right answer in this case is A, $1,543. That second figure, $3,148, is currently the maximum allowable benefit payable per month, but $1,543 is our average. So for our Zoom audience, I'll put some additional learning references into the chat. I also wanted to respond to a question from Eric and Sharon, who would like to know, why is it legal and possible for Congress to take money from Social Security and so leave it underfunded? So how were they able to do that? Why could they just draw on the money? Well, the simplest answer is that Congress is basically making its own rules, and that there's a pool of money which is available as the federal budget, Federal Reserve at any given time. And so in essence, Congress has spent against or spent out of Social Security funding. It has not been in a protected pool, which Congress was unable to touch. So part of the fact that we have a federal deficit doesn't just mean that we don't have enough money to do everything that we are spending for at the moment, but that Congress has tapped into the money it has, regardless of what it was supposed to be reserved for, and spent it down. So I guess the simplest answer to the why is it legal and possible is because the body that makes the laws was the one doing it. So they got to decide. So Jacqueline has a question. Is Social Security based on the raises you receive from work? What if you don't receive raises? What's the rule for early retirement? And Brian has another question. We're always told that Social Security will run out at some point, and how true is this? So to respond to Jacqueline, if you were not getting raises, yes, that would impact how much money you're eligible for. More generally, how much you were earning, and therefore how much was being withheld as a percentage from your paycheck, will affect your benefits eligibility. So Social Security benefits are not the same for everyone. People who are paying more into the system because they were getting paid more, who were making more money, also get bigger retirement benefits out of the system. What's the rule for early retirement? Well, as noted, there have been a number of amendments and changes. The answer to that question is less simple than you might think. Some things you still would not be eligible for until the age of 65. But if you take early retirement, or 62 in some instances, depending on the program, but if you take early retirement for reasons of disability, if you're unable to work, then you might be eligible sooner for SSDI. Brian has asked again, we're told that Social Security will run out at some point. How true is this? It's an interesting question. I think that statement is a little too simple. The basic idea is that we've got this huge baby boom generation retiring. The federal government has spent a lot of the money that they've paid in, and in addition, they get cost of living adjustments. So the money that they've paid in is going to is less in dollar amounts than what they expect to be receiving back out. And one of the challenges that we face, so there's a term called the blue wave, which basically describes this huge generation of baby boomers who are retiring. So all of these people who are transitioning from the workforce into retirement and into retirement benefits eligibility. And because Congress has not done a good job of saving up all the money that they paid in, that means that a lot of the money to fund those benefits have to come out of the paychecks of younger people who continue to work. But younger generations are not as large as the baby boom generation. So one of the arguments that some policymakers will make is that, well, the dollars that were paid in are going to be used up, and people are still going to have benefits, especially as life expectancies, at least for more privileged groups, are fairly high. So they're basically saying, we'll have to pay out more than was ever paid in, and there won't be a large enough working population to support that. It is a little too simple, though, because, for instance, if our government had kept all that money in trust as it's supposed to and had been investing it, the profits could easily have kept up with the cost of living adjustments. The sort of current state of our economy is complex, and I don't think can be reduced to arguments about entitlements or benefits. So again, I think there's some truth to the statement that Brian raised and questioned. but the analysis of it should be more complex, and I've only shared a tiny bit of it. Eric and Sharon have asked for a link to the BEST tool. Yes, I'll be happy to put that in the chat. And for those looking for it listening, you can also look up the Social Security Administration and type in BEST. Jacqueline asked, if a company retires you at 55, can you collect Social Security benefits? Generally, you would still have to wait until you were eligible based on disability or age, but it wouldn't hurt to use the BEST tool to see if there's anything that you'd be eligible for now. And of course, unemployment insurance, which is mostly administered separately now through the states, but was part of the original plan, is also an option for people who are forcibly retired. Patty is saying she will collect from spousal benefits and will be able to use them this year. And is asking if her partner waits to use his Social Security benefits, will she also have an increase in her monthly dollars? That's a great question, Patty, and I'm not sure because their number, first of all, I don't claim to fully understand all of the very complex eligibility requirements, but also there's more information that would need to be known to assess your eligibility, but possibly yes, which would be a good reason to take a look at that tool. So thank you, audience, for all these great questions. Oh, Jacqueline is asking, what's the rule on divorce? That's a good question, but generally speaking, if you are divorced from someone, you would not have access to their Social Security benefits. It's an interesting question. How could that come up in divorce settlements and so forth? But my understanding is generally not, though I encourage you to take a look at the BEST tool to see. One more question. Angela says, I'm a recipient of SSDI. I'm going to hit retirement age. Would I still be collecting the same amount? The money that I put in is relevant. I had enough credits to retire. Angela, I don't know. And some of that will be that the Social Security Administration may be changing allocations in response to new amendments in legislation. So I could only guess at what your benefit would be at the age of 65. Brian is asking, what if you work for a school district that requires its employees to pay into a pension system? Do you still receive Social Security? If you have only ever worked for an employer that has not withheld Social Security benefits, and that does happen, there's some systems which are eligible to not to create a separate pension system and then not do Social Security withholding. Then yes, that would affect your Social Security benefits. But if you paid in ever for any job, right, and you have a Social Security system, a Social Security number, you likely have some eligibility. But it certainly might mean that your benefits would be lower than if you'd had regular pay. In fact, it would mean that your benefits would be lower generally than if you'd had regular paycheck withholding. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for the great questions and interest. And I wanted to invite folks to join us next week for our session on public schooling, which will be led by our Repair team of student interns. We're really excited to have youth educators leading this subject. So I'll be off camera next week, but excited to turn it over to our team. And I will be back on August 22nd to talk to you about domestic terrorism policy. On August 29th, we're very excited to be joined by Nicole Hernandez of Puerto Ricans in Action, who's going to be having a conversation with us about colonized territories of the United States government, and in particular, Puerto Rico, which continues to be a US colony, but not a US state. So we'll be talking to Nicole Hernandez again on August 29th, and have also set up our session for September 5th on youth incarceration, featuring Dominique Nong of the Children's Defense Fund, joined by Edgar Ibarra, who is a former youth incarceration survivor and ongoing advocate and activist. So I hope to see many of you over the next several sessions, and we have some great programs coming up separate from the Civics Project this week. We'll be doing this coming week, we'll be doing a screening of the film Def Jam on Wednesday, which focuses on a deaf spoken word artist and slam poet. And we'll be joined by filmmaker Judy Leaf, who'll be with us to answer questions after the film. The film is closed captioned, and we will have an ASL interpreter there for all the discussion. And on December 13th, we will be having a virtual roundtable moderated by Karin Gustafson and including Leroy Moore, Liat Ben Moshe, and Nirmala Arevalis on the subject of caged disability, incarceration, and the destruction of life chances, to focus on the mass incarceration of people with disabilities, often including people with mental illness, and particularly people of color with disabilities. So hope to see some of you at our other programs this week and in the upcoming weeks for the Civics Project. Thanks again for everyone joining us. For those who want the link to the BEST tool, I will put it in the chat in Zoom after. And for all of our listening audience, thank you so much for listening in. And please like us and give us 5 stars on your podcast hosting platform. Thanks, everyone.